We'll read the first 7 verses and then we'll leave the rest. We'll walk through this psalm together and read through the rest of the passage. But Psalm 105, verses 1 through 7. O give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name. Make known his deeds among the peoples. Sing to him, sing praises to him. Speak of all his wonders. Glory in his holy name. Let the heart of those who seek him or seek the Lord be glad. Seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his face continually. Remember his wonders which he has done, his marvels and the judgments uttered by his mouth. O seed of Abraham his servant, O sons of Jacob his chosen ones. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. I easily could have kept preaching on the last group of Psalms, and I could easily do several messages from this one. But we're going to try to consolidate into one as we walk through the Psalm. This is one of the Psalms I thoroughly enjoy and come back to often. And there is a connection between this Psalm and Psalm 104 and Psalm 106. And really, all three of them reflect on the faithfulness of God. Psalm 104 deals with his relationship to all of creation, his provision for them. And then in Psalm 106, it's interesting because we have this story of sin, essentially, of the nation of Israel. And in the midst of all of that, there is this reminder that God is always faithful, even though we are not. And Psalm 105 is going to focus on the fidelity of the Lord again, but this in regards to his covenant relationship with the nation of Israel. But the primary thing I want to look at is the providence of God, his sovereignty. We've already established the fact that he is Lord over all things. He reigns over all the universe. He reigns in all of our lives. And so therefore, he has this great eternal plan and he is carrying it out. And Psalm 105 is going to deal with the providence of God. But there's some things that I wanted to think about as we come into this psalm. So if you have your Bibles ready, there's a tendency at times for us to think of God as working only in the dramatic or cataclysmic or even the miraculous. And it's interesting because in this psalm, if you turn with me, Psalm 105, verses 27 through 31, it says this: They performed his wondrous acts among them and miracles in the land of Ham. So in this section, we're going to look at the plagues that God brought to deliver his people out of Egypt. Verse 28. And he sent darkness and he made it dark. And they did not rebel against his words. He turned their waters into blood and cursed their fish to die. Their land swarmed with frogs, even the chambers of their kings. He spoke and there came a swarm of flies and gnats in all their territory. So here we see the wondrous acts of God, the miraculous acts of God. He uses the things of nature to deliver his people from the land of Egypt. We see the tendency is we can think of God in the good things of life. And usually we see that. We see it in our friendships and our families and health and even the degree of our prosperity. We see the hand of God in that. We have no trouble acknowledging God's sovereignty there. Notice with me verse 24. It says this: And he caused his people to be very fruitful and made them stronger than their adversaries. And this is talking about the nation of Israel. As they were in the land of Egypt and they settled there, they began to grow and to flourish and they became fruitful and they began to outnumber those who they were eventually enslaved to. In verse 37, notice with me in Psalm 105, Then he brought them out with silver and gold, and among his tribes there was not one who stumbled. And in Psalm 105, verse 43, And he brought forth his people with joy, his chosen ones with a joyful shout. We have no trouble seeing God in these great cataclysmic things or even in the good things of life. And we do that. We see something that God does in our life and it's a good thing and we thank him for that, and we ought to. But it's interesting because in this psalm we see that life is more than just that. There are diseases, there's tornadoes, there are hurricanes. We see in the news there's flooding down in Texas. There are earthquakes and there's even famine. And it's interesting because we see that God is behind all of these things. Notice with me in Psalm 105 verse 16. And he called forth a famine upon the land and he broke the whole staff of bread. And in verse 32 he gave them hail for rain and flaming fire in their land. We see that even God controls these things, even the acts of weather. And oftentimes with the insurance companies, right, they refer to them as acts of God. We see the hand of God in all of these things. The thing that's difficult for us is when we look at these hard times, these difficult things, it's hard for us to grapple with the fact that God is sovereign in our life. We can see Him in the good things and we praise Him for that, but what about the bad things? What about the things that we think are negative that happen in our life? Can we see God in that? And oftentimes we have trouble grappling with that, especially if we have the view that God is got a goal and a task in mind, and that is to bring about good always, right? And so sometimes we think that every event in our life ought to be a good thing, not a bad thing. But we have to keep in mind the simple fact, God is at work in everything. And for the Old Testament writers, they could not conceive of anything happening without God working and willing in the midst of it. They saw God in everything, even the bad stuff. So He is at work both in the pleasant or obviously good and the unpleasant and seemingly not good events. Notice Psalm 105 verse 25. He turned their heart to hate His people, to deal craftily with His servants. But think about that one for a moment. He turned their heart to hate His people. This was talking about the Egyptians. And they began to oppress the people of God. Who caused that to happen? God did. We have trouble with this, do we not? But it is clear all the way through the Old Testament, God is in everything that happens, both willing and working. That does not mean that human beings are not accountable for what they do. They absolutely are. But God is sovereign over everything, and nothing passes through this universe without God willing or working in the midst of that. So we may not be able to identify in every circumstance of our life. We may not be able to see at every moment God's hand in things, but we must always just trust and know that He is at work. And nothing in our life ever just happens. He has a plan, He has a purpose, and He's going to work that out. And it cannot be thwarted, as we'll see when we walk through this psalm together. So this is a praise for God's providential provision, Psalm 105. And I wanted to walk through this psalm together, and it really has this movement. It is a celebration, and it's a movement from Egypt to the conquest is really what it is. But it's going to establish the background for us, and it's going to go back even further. So really the structure of the psalm follows this historical pattern from covenant to fulfillment of covenant. God makes a covenant with Abraham, and He is going to fulfill that covenant. And the great thing for us is we know that we are involved in that. Is God gave the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis chapter 12. He then later developed it further in 2 Samuel 7, then in Deuteronomy, then in Jeremiah 31. As He elaborates on this, He reveals the fact that we are all a part of this covenant plan of God. So if we can follow the structure, it's this way. We have the opening praise in Psalm 105 verses 1 through 6. We have the closing praise in Psalm 105 verse 45. And then we have the covenant of promise and then the covenant of promise fulfilled, Psalm 105 verses 37 through 45. And in the middle of this is a focus on God's providence and His provision for His people. But the whole psalm is about the providence of God. It's Him working out faithfully in regards to the covenant that He has made with His people. And we can hang on to these truths for our own life as well. So here's the psalm, if you will. The first part, 7 through 11, the covenant of promise. He says this, He is the Lord our God, if you want to follow the text. He carries out judgment through the earth. He always remembers His covenant decree, the promise He made to 1,000 generations. The promise He made to Abraham, the promise He made by oath to Isaac. He gave it to Jacob as a decree, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as the portion of your inheritance. And God is not finished with this yet. He will then give them back the land that is still a part of God's divine plan. Then we have the fulfillment of this promise in the same psalm. Follow with me in verse 37 and following. He brought His people out enriched with silver and gold. None of His tribes stumbled. Egypt was happy when they left, for they were afraid of them. For He remembered His holy word He made to Abraham His servant. When He led His people out, they rejoiced. His chosen ones shouted with joy. He handed the territory of nations over to them, and they took possession of what other peoples had produced. All the way through their lives, God was faithful to them. And there is periods that the psalmist deals with in Psalm 105. But as he walks through these periods, just keep in mind, he is dealing with individual people in those periods. Therefore, when we are looking at our life, we are in the church age and God is working out His plan. We are in the church age, but understand He is working in each of our lives in the way that this psalmist reflects. So we see the movement going from the majesty and wonders that God has worked in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's time. And this is interesting. I was reflecting on this. My grandma McDougall, she was always in awe about this fact. And she used to say this over and over. She was so in awe about the fact that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was her God as well. And whatever He did for them, He would do for her. And He would do for us. Notice the majesty and wonders of Joseph's time, verses 16 through 23. And then we move to the majesty and wonders of God seen in Moses' time, verses 24 through 43. And then the majesty and wonders of God seen in Joshua's time, verses 44 through 45. So although the psalmist walks through various periods of history, understand he is dealing with individual people in those times. And he is working out his plan in and through their lives. So the Lord of God is the Lord of history. And I wanted to show this to you because there is a historical sweep that runs through here. And it begins with verses 7 and 8. And it says this in verse 7. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. So establishing His sovereignty, not only over His specific special people, but over all of the earth, He still holds sway. And then comes verse 8. He has remembered His covenant forever, the word which He commanded to 1,000 generations. And this really starts the progress going. And this moves the text along as he moves from period to period. Now, I'm going to assume, okay? I'm going to assume this morning that there are certain things about the Old Testament that you know. We can't keep flipping around everywhere, but I'm just going to assume that you have a basic knowledge of the Old Testament as we walk through these periods. But notice with me, first we have the inauguration of the covenant, verses 7 through 11. And we'll come back and look at these in a little more detail. Then we have the nomadic wanderings in Canaan, verses 12 through 15. God promises Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis chapter 12, which is the turning point, not only in Genesis, this is the turning point in all of Scripture. Genesis 12 is when God makes that Abrahamic covenant with him and is an everlasting covenant. And everything that flows out of that. Even the blessing in our life and the salvation that comes and our relationship to the Messiah all flows out of the Abrahamic covenant. So God makes His covenant. He calls Abraham out of his native land, and He brings them into the land of Canaan, and we find them throughout Genesis wandering through the land of Canaan. And then we have the story of Joseph in Egypt, verses 16 through 22. Then we have the period of the Exodus, verses 23 through 38. We saw the miraculous works that God had done, the plagues that He had performed to deliver Israel. But first we have Israel entering Egypt. Then we have Moses and the plagues, and then we have Israel leaving Egypt. And the whole entire episode of Exodus is amazing because when Exodus starts, it starts with groaning. The people of God are crying out to God. They're enslaved to the Egyptians. They cry out to God. God hears their cry. And then He intervenes on their behalf, and He's going to bring Moses. He's going to deliver them out of Egypt. And when we come out of Egypt, He brings them up to Mount Sinai, and there He's going to enter into a constitution with them. His law He's going to establish for them. And we have Exodus finally ending with the glory of God as they finish the tabernacle. The Shekinah glory comes down and resides in the tabernacle. So Exodus has this movement from groaning to glory. But we have the history of it laid out briefly for us in these episodes in the Psalm 105 from verse 23 through verse 38. And again, we'll come back and look at these in a moment. Then we have the period of wilderness wanderings, verses 39 through 43 of this psalm. And these are reflected in Exodus chapter 13, verse 19. And then we have the period of conquest, Joshua 105, verse 44. And understand there's a lot of history that falls within these. And the psalmist is assuming that we know these things. The nation of Israel would have known this as they sung this psalm. They would have known the events that took place and filled in the gaps for these periods of history. But the purpose of this, it's just one picture. And if I could sum it up, it's just this. When we look at this psalm, the focus is the fact that God is faithful. He is a faithful, promise-making, promise-keeping God. That's the one thing that's so awesome about God. I mean, we make promises, right? And I make promises to my kids. I promise that we'll do this or do that. And I really try my best to fulfill those promises. But we know we are going to let them down, right? And we may be able to fulfill that promise if we make one over a period of time. We may be able to carry it for a certain period of time. But eventually, we will fail. The amazing thing about God is He never fails. Never. He can't. As Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, he says, even though we are faithless, He remains faithful, for He cannot deny Himself. It is contrary to God's nature to not be faithful. He has to be faithful. So in this picture in the psalm, we have a faithful, promise-making, promise-keeping God, mysterious in his ways, but ever mindful of his people, ever planning ahead for their good, and ever meeting their needs. And it is true not only for the nation of Israel and for the individuals that we know lie behind this history, but it is true for you and I as well, that God is providentially at work in our lives, both working and willing. So notice with me, the Lord promises. And we'll start with the covenant promises in verses 7 through 8. And here is the covenant of promise. And he starts off with this in verse 7. He makes 2 points essentially by this. The Lord is the God of Israel. Eloheinu, he is our God, he says in the first part of verse 7. But also he makes the statement that his judgments are in all the earth. In other words, his authority extends to all of the earth. And this is a great way that he starts off this section, because when we see God in the Old Testament, we see him dealing with his people, we always see in the backdrop that he holds universal sway over everything. In other words, when he makes this a covenant with Abraham, he's going to ratify it in Genesis chapter 15. And he is going to establish the fact that the sin of the Amorites is going to finally come to a time where it is filled up, and then God is going to deliver Abraham's descendants. He's going to bring them into the land of Canaan. But for God to do that, he must not only be the God of Abraham, he must be the God of the Amorites. In other words, he must hold sovereign sway and rule over even those who lived in the land of Canaan for him to fulfill this promise. So when we look at this, we realize that when this statement is made in regards to God, it is crucial, because whatever promises he makes, you realize with Abraham, he moved nations. He moved nations to fulfill this promise. That's astounding to me. I mean, especially when, I'm thinking about studying Greek and teaching the New Testament, that the fact that God moved nations so that we could have that one revelation in that language as he intended to be given. God does the same thing in our lives. He still works providentially. And so we can look at the nation we live in now, and there are times we can grieve. There's times that we can look and wonder what's going to happen to our children. But at the same time, we realize that God is sovereign. And whatever happens, he is always on the throne. Always. So notice with me then the covenant that is made in verses 8 through 10. And there's several terms that are utilized here. First, it's referred to as a covenant, verse 8, the first line. The word which was commanded to 1,000 generations. Verse 9, he says, the covenant which he made with Abraham, his oath to Isaac. Then in verse 10, then he confirmed it to Jacob for a statute or a decree. So we have the covenant made by the Lord, which is equivalent to the oath or a decree that was given to Jacob. And combined, they reflect something for us. They tell us this, essentially, when we look at these terms. First, we understand when we talk about this covenant, it is a freely made, unchangeable commitment by God. It's not a bargain. When God made the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12, it was unconditional. It was not conditioned on what Abraham would do or could do. It was not conditional on descendants. It was always conditioned upon God. When he reaffirmed it with Isaac and he reaffirmed it with Jacob, it was always, I will, I will, I will, I will. And this was freely done. This was part of God's sovereign grace. There was nothing earned in it for Abraham. At the time that God called Abraham, we find at the end of Joshua, we find that Abraham was the worshiper of many gods. He wasn't seeking after God, the one true God. And God called him out of his land and out of worshiping these false gods to be his foundation for his people. It is a sovereign stated intention that God, he is a God to Abraham and his descendants, and that they are to be his people. And this sovereign administration of grace, in this promise, in this context, he's going to focus primarily upon the land. And you notice he refers that in verse 11, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as the portion of your inheritance. So there were many aspects to the covenant that God made with Abraham. The focus of the psalmist here is going to focus on the promise of the land. Because historically, we could see how God promised that they would come in and have that land, and then God fulfilled that. And if that is true, that God has fulfilled that aspect of bringing him into the land of Canaan, then he can fulfill any other aspect of that covenant. This is the thing that we rejoice in when we read the Gospel of Matthew. How many times Matthew says, as it was written in the prophet of so-and-so. Over and over we find that God fulfills his prophetic word. The covenant of promise is eternally valid. This isn't a temporal thing. So this isn't to be understood as the covenant that was entered into at Mount Sinai when God gave them their constitution. This is something different as Paul talks, or as the psalmist talks about here in verses 8 and following. But in verse 8, the second line, he says, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations. And then in verse 10, he says that this is an everlasting covenant. In other words, the promises that God gave Abraham in the covenant were going to extend into the millennial kingdom and beyond. The blessing of the Messiah has eternal implications for all of us. Therefore, it's an everlasting covenant. That's why when we watch, and it's so amazing when you watch, just in my lifetime, watching history unfold. And you look at the nation of Israel, and it's just this tiny spot on this huge earth, right? This one little spot. And there is so much that happens there all the time. Why? Because that's the promised land. And it will one day be the Holy Land, which is interesting because we call it the Holy Land. It's not the Holy Land yet. It is the Holy Land when it is purified and the Messiah then comes and will establish his millennial reign. That's when it will be the Holy Land. But this is an everlasting covenant, and God will be faithful to that. The covenant promises made by God, who is not only faithful, but he is also able. No matter what generations passed, and you follow through the Old Testament over and over, we find that God is faithful to the covenant that he made, and the fact that he is able is reflected in verse 7. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He's capable of fulfilling it. So Joshua says this in 21:45, not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. Now behold, today I am going the way of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All have been fulfilled for you. Not one of them has failed. Notice the focus on the fact that there is no failure when it comes to God. He will fulfill everything. God is the one who protects. Verses 12 through 15. Notice with me as the psalmist lays this out. He says, when they were only few men in number and very few and strangers in it. So this is when they're wandering in the land of Canaan. So Abraham comes, he comes into the land that God calls him to, and they are going to wander through this land. And they were few in number and they were not stable. And both the terms reflect this. They were sojourners and they were wanderers. And it's interesting because God promises Abraham, you're going to have this land. But when you get to the end of Genesis, what did he own? A tomb, and that was it. That's all he owned. So you sit there and think, well, man, here God promises the land, and yet then at the end of Genesis, all they own is a tomb, and that's it, just this little plot of land, and that's all, a burial site. But notice what Hebrews says in regards to Abraham. And I'll just tell you, Abraham, he was eschatological, even way back then. Notice with me what it says. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as an alien in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. All these died in faith without receiving the promises. Listen to that. Without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Even though they never saw it in their lifetime, they still trusted and believed that God was going to fulfill his promise. And what did he do? He fulfilled it. He fulfilled it. This is the great thing about faith. And this is faith is in that which is not seen. Yes? But how much do we have? We're constantly asking for that sort of empirical evidence. God, show me, then I'll believe. Abraham never saw it, and even his lifetime, he did not see it, but yet he still trusted and believed. And even though they were few in number, God always protected this community. Verses 14 and 50, notice with me in Psalm 105. He permitted no man to oppress them, and he reproved kings for their sakes. Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm. Now, if we know our Old Testament history, we know that in the backdrop of this, we know that things happened in regards to Abraham's life, and he encountered kings. But notice this emphatic statement, no one was to undo God's purposes, neither man nor king. And this is what we call merismus, or merism. Takes the extremes, a man, a peasant, and then the king, and everything in between. In other words, there is no one who can undo God's purposes. You look at Joseph's life, right? In Joseph's life, his brothers hated him. And this was after he told them about the dreams, and they already disliked him before, but then he tells them about the dreams, right? You're going to bow down and worship me. So they despised Joseph, and they wanted to kill Joseph. Text says they literally hated Joseph, and they wanted to put to death. And they said, let's kill him, and then let's see what comes of his dreams then, right? So their actions were trying to thwart the very dreams that Joseph said, this is what was going to happen. But their very actions brought about the fulfillment of those dreams. Did they not? Because in their hatred, they sold him off to be a slave. And where did he wind up? Egypt. There is no man can thwart the purpose of God. No one. No one. No president, no king, no one. So by plagues and dreams, the Lord rebuked kings. We know the story of Pharaoh, right? And in both cases, Abraham lied. So it wasn't because of Abraham's lie. It was in spite of Abraham's sin. God still delivered him from Pharaoh and delivered him from Abimelech. And he also prospered in those situations, Abraham did. But God was watching over them, and they did not prevail against Abraham. The Lord prepares. This is awesome. Verses 16 through 24. And I just encourage you, go back through this psalm on your own and meditate on the truths that are here. But the Lord holds sway in all the earth. We see it in verse 7. The Lord controls the earth's events. Now notice what happens in verse 16. Then he called for famine upon the land, and he broke the whole staff of bread. Notice, he called down, he broke, talking about God. He did this. But why were the necessities of life withdrawn? In other words, he despoiled the food. It was all gone. There was nothing to eat. Why did God do this? Let me show you. In understanding, this is the God who prepares. Notice, if you will, with me. Go up to verse 23. Israel also came into Egypt. Thus Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. Why did God send the famine? He was going to get Jacob into the land of Egypt. He tells him later in Genesis chapter 46, in the first few verses, he says, Jacob, don't be afraid to go to Egypt. Don't be afraid to go there, because I'm going to take you there and I'm going to multiply your descendants. I'm going to be faithful to the covenant that I made to your forefathers. So God brings about a famine. Egypt is stored up with food. Jacob is then going to, because of this famine, be brought into Egypt. And there God is going to produce a nation of peoples. And then he's going to deliver them from there. Our God works like this. He prepares like this. He moves things to make provision in our life. So I did this one time with Les and the little ones. We lived in Russia. And we were sitting down at dinner table and we were eating our meal. And I said, just stop and think about the different things of we are eating on this table, the things that we have that God has provided, and why we thank Him for that. And I said, if you take the vegetables we're eating, just think about this. When in Russia, it was a communist country, certain families were given what they had called dachas, little plots of land. They could grow their own produce and fruits and stuff like that. And they were outside the cities. And they were given this land. And when communism fell and the countries went through radical changes, the people were still able to hold on to those plots of land. So what they would do is they would cultivate that land, and they would produce fruit for themselves and vegetables, and some of it they'd take and sell on the roadside. Then we would come along and we would buy vegetables and fruit, whatever, from them, from their dachas, and this is what we would eat. And I said, do you realize that God moved a nation, gave people land to grow these things, to produce these things, and now they sit and sell us the same food? God did that. It's hard for us to see that in America because everything's so mass-produced. Right? We can walk in the store and find just about anything we look for or want or desire or crave. It's hard for us to see that in America, but it is no less true. God moves nations to provide for our needs. He does this. Think about the oil in our cars and the gas and everything else that we have. God does this. And notice even more specifically the providential provision that He made through Joseph. Verses 17 through 24. Notice, He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave, and they afflicted his feet with fetters. He himself was laid in irons until the time that his word came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. Why did he have to suffer? It's part of God's design. He was God's man in God's place in God's timing. God sent Joseph there to prepare the way for what was to come. He goes through all of these difficulties. And I just sometimes go back and reread the life of Joseph and what happened. I mean, first you have his brothers who hate him and want to kill him. They sell him off into slavery, and you can think, man, the immediate outcome, not so good, right? He's a slave of Potiphar. But then what happens? God prospers Joseph in Potiphar's household. Potiphar hands over everything to Joseph except for his food. He hands over everything in control except for his wife, right? Then you have Potiphar's wife. She makes advances at Joseph, and Joseph shuns her. And then he runs off, and he loses his coat, and it's left by the side. And then she lies, right, and says that he made advances on her, so they put him in prison. He did the right thing. But where did he wind up? He winded up in prison. I mean, think about that. He did the right thing. So sometimes we look in our life, we think, well, I did what God wanted me to do. How come everything isn't working out? How come I'm here and not there? Remember, God is working out His plan. So what does He do when Joseph's in prison? He prospers. The prison guard puts him in charge of everything. Two men have dreams. Chief wine taster, chief baker. They have dreams, and Joseph says, hey, God reveals these things. He says, tell me your dreams, and I'll tell you what they mean. So they tell him the dreams, and he tells them. 3 days, you're both going to be released. Chief wine taster, you're going to be set free, and you're going to be restored to the position you had. Chief baker, sorry, buddy, but you're out of here, right? But he says to the chief wine taster, just remember me when you go before Pharaoh. Tell him about me. So what does he do? He forgets. He forgets. 2 years, Joseph is sitting incarcerated, right? He's sitting in prison. 2 years goes by. Finally, Pharaoh has these dreams. And he says, my men can't tell me what they mean. And the chief wine taster says, oh, my bad, sorry. There's this guy that I did time with. He told me the meaning of my dream, and I bet you he can do that for you. So they bring Joseph in, and he tells them the meaning of the dream. And what does he do? Pharaoh established him as authority just under him over everything in the land of Egypt. Everything. You know what's amazing about the story of Joseph? There's no indication where it says that he did anything majorly wrong. I mean, just think about that. There's no time where we ever find Joseph expressing bitterness or anger or frustration or any of that. I believe that he lived in light of the providence of God. And in every situation, he knew that God was in control. And ultimately, then God brings him out. So he had to go through all that suffering to finally get to the position. I mean, how else is he going to get close to Pharaoh other than get in contact with his chief wine taster? These were men who were part of the inner court. So we would look at that and say, that's a bad thing. No, it's exactly what God needed to do to get him into Pharaoh's court, to fulfill his plan in his life. So Joseph was God's man in God's determined place, in God's determined time. And the Lord was working according to His eternal wisdom to fulfill His word and to have a ruler of Egypt to welcome and feed His needy people. And when Jacob came and he was going to prosper, there was an incubator set up by God providentially in the nation so His people could flourish to the point of almost 2 million people when they left Egypt. They walked out of there. And they didn't walk out of there empty-handed. Notice the Lord redeems, and you can go back and look through this, the plagues that are laid out for us, and we know the story of the Exodus, but the Lord provides. And I leave you with these thoughts. The Lord provided for the material and physical needs. It's interesting because in chapter 11 of Exodus, God says, you know what, I'm going to touch the hearts of the Egyptians, and they're going to give you all their stuff. So then in chapter 12, verse 35, we read that the Egyptians came and handed over all their gold and silver and everything else. They had favor for the nation of Israel. They gave them all these things. So when they walked out with their hands and carts full of everything. So God's like, not only am I going to take you out of here, I'm going to take you out of here loaded. And it's exactly what He did. The Lord provided guidance and safety for their needs. He provided protection for them. And it's interesting that when in Exodus talks about that God led them out of Egypt, He didn't take them by the way of the Philistines because they didn't know war yet. They weren't warriors. They were shepherds, brickmakers, slaves. They didn't know how to fight. And God said if they see war, they're going to run away. So He took them by another route. They went by the Red Sea. So we have in Exodus 13:21 says this, the Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day and led them on the way. And in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. And He did not take away the pillar of the cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. The angel of God who had been going before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. He protected them every step of the way. The angel of God was there. You realize that God watches over you and I in the same way? He's the same God who protects us as well. There is no fear of harm for us as His people. None. They provided for food that they needed. Exodus 16, 12 through 23. Here's what's awesome. He provided a manna from heaven. And then they're going to complain. So then He gives them quail, right? Till it's coming out their nostrils. But He provides from the whole way. Here's what's amazing to me. You get to the book of Joshua. In chapter 5, they're preparing to go over into land. They cross the Jordan on dry land, right? So mimicking the Red Sea. They cross over dry land. They're going to circumcise themselves. And they eat fruit of the land. And it says in Joshua that the manna ceased when they ate the fruit of the land. In other words, God provided for them. Even in those 40 years of wandering in the wilderness when they were being punished, He provided manna from heaven. He still was faithful to them, even though they were faithless. And even though that generation, the first one was going to die off in the desert as punishment for their sin, He still provided for them. All the way up until they came to cross into the land. And when they tasted the fruit of the land that He promised them, the manna stopped. That's our God. He provides even in spite of who we are. He provided water out of a rock. I mean, come on. Out of a rock. Out of a rock. It's amazing the things that God does, isn't it? The other thing is so staggering to me. All those 40 years of wandering in the wilderness because of their sin, the scriptures tell us that not the sandals of their feet did not wear out at all. Just think about that. All the walking, all the wandering, and their sandals never wore out for 40 years. The little mundane things that we would think insignificant, God still provided for their feet. It's amazing, isn't it? But God does that. My kids need a pair of shoes. I know He's going to provide them. They may have a few holes in them, but it's okay. As a missionary kid, I got hand-me-downs. Sometimes the shoes were a little too big. Yeah, you stuff another pair of socks in there. But you had shoes on your feet. How do we respond then? How do we respond to a God with such display of promise-keeping, protection, anticipation of need, and deliverance and provision? We praise the Lord. You got to praise the Lord. Give thanks, sing, and glory in His holy name. Thank Him. And we need to proclaim it. We need to tell the world and make His deeds known. Just tell people what God does in your life. It's that simple. It's that simple. The Lord is to be pursued. Over and over the psalmist says, seek the Lord, seek His face, come before Him, and the Lord is to be obeyed. We are to keep His statutes, and we are to observe His laws. God reveals Himself sovereignly through His sovereign hand as He leads and orchestrates and guides in the circumstances of our life. But He also reveals Himself not only providentially, but through His written word. And this will we need to always know and walk in obedience of. May God help us. Dad, would you close in a word of prayer, please?